Before Father Vincent Lampert ever heard the details, he made one point whenever he retold a case he'd only read about or received secondhand. The names were changed on purpose. Not to decorate the story, not to soften it, but to keep ordinary people from being hunted by extraordinary consequences. The real names stayed buried in reports and sealed files. The names you are about to hear are placeholders, chosen so the listener can follow the thread without getting lost. It began the way so many tragedies begin in an American city in summer. Heat that clung to brick, street lights that made the pavement look wet even when it was dry, and a call that sounded routine until it didn't. Southside Chicago, Illinois. Near midnight, a dispatcher sent 2 uniformed officers to a small Korean-owned grocery after a report of a fight. It was not a bank robbery, not an active shooter, not an emergency that would make headlines by morning. It was the kind of call a precinct expects to handle a dozen times a week. Raised voices, someone shoving someone else, the tense, quick math of who's lying and who's terrified. One of the officers was a patrolman who'd been on the job long enough to know the neighborhood's habits and how quickly a simple call could turn into a funeral. He had the posture of a man trained to keep his hands visible and his face blank. In the story Father Lampert later received, he was called Mark. The second officer's name mattered less than the first reports. What mattered was what came over the radio just minutes after they arrived. Officer involved shooting, suspect down, need an ambulance. The first time Father Lampert read that line, he didn't picture blood. He pictured paperwork. He pictured the way a sentence like that travels through a department, clipped, practiced, already leaning toward justification. Words are not bullets, but they can be used the same way. They can hit what they're aimed at. They can miss and still ruin a life. The young man on the ground was called Derek in the file Father Lampert reviewed, 19 years old, black, 2 rounds in the chest. The report said he rushed the officer, that he had a gun at his waistband, that the officer fired in self-defense. Those phrases were arranged like furniture in a staged room, familiar, comfortable, meant to tell you, before you could ask, that everything was necessary. And yet, even in the earliest notes, one detail kept showing up like grit in a clean hand. When Derek went down, he did not have a weapon in his hands. Not a knife, not a gun, nothing. A few feet from the body, after internal affairs arrived, a firearm appeared in the story as if it had been waiting its turn to enter the scene. An old revolver, not the kind of modern pistol that moves through a city like Chicago the way rumors do, passed from hand to hand, traded and tucked and flashed for intimidation. This gun was described as worn, dated, the kind of steel that looks tired even when it's clean. It was bagged, tagged, and taken back to the station, District 12, where it was logged and locked away. Evidence Locker 12. In the beginning, it was only a location on a form, a number on a key ring, a metal door in a basement. Father Lampert had seen enough police stations in his life to know what those basements smelled like: old coffee, stale smoke that had seeped into paint decades ago, damp concrete, and the sharp, sterile bite of disinfectant that never quite wins. Places like that hold more than objects. They hold the residue of panic, anger, and the strange quiet that follows violence. A detective called Maria in the account arrived from a unit that handled shootings involving officers. She was not new to the job, and she was not impressed by confident voices. The story described her as a woman raised in a working family, shaped by neighborhoods where people learned early that uniforms did not always mean safety. She had joined the department with a stubborn belief that she could be different, that she could be the kind of officer the city needed rather than the kind it feared. She walked into the grocery and felt immediately that something in the scene was off. The security camera, she was told, had malfunctioned at the worst possible moment, just long enough to miss the critical seconds. The store owner and the customers offered variations of the same uneasy statement. They heard shouting, they heard a bang, they saw the young man collapse, but they did not see a gun in his hands. The revolver that had been recovered looked to Maria's eye like it belonged to another decade. She asked a question that every honest investigator must ask, even when it makes enemies. Where did this come from? The answers were soft and slippery. People shrugged. People pointed at procedure. Someone used a word like chaos, as if chaos were a permission slip. Someone else said the officers had limited visibility, even though the aisle lights were bright and the counter area was open. When Maria pushed, the pressure returned in a different form, quiet, bureaucratic, and heavy. The city was tense. The department wanted a clean ending, a quick ruling, self-defense, case closed. Father Lampert would later reflect that evil does not always announce itself with fireworks. Sometimes it enters like a suggestion, a shortcut, a little bend in the road that saves time. The temptation is not, at first, to commit a grand crime. The temptation is to adjust, to smooth, to make a messy truth fit neatly into a box where no one has to lose sleep. Maria felt that temptation pressing against her from every side. The more she studied the file, the more she sensed two stories running alongside each other, the official narrative and the one that lived in the gaps. She went back to District 12 to see the evidence procedures firsthand. Down in the property room, an officer assigned to manage intake and storage called Lionel in the report moved with the wary precision of someone who had learned to trust locks more than people. He showed her rows of shelves and cages, bags sealed with tape, weapons in boxes, knives and narcotics, and stacks of cash, everything tagged and cataloged so the court system could pretend the world was orderly. Evidence locker 12 sat deeper in the room, in a darker corner where the overhead lights didn't feel as strong, a steel cabinet with a mechanical lock, ordinary at first glance. But the story said the older cop spoke about it in the way men speak about a bad stretch of highway at night, half joking, half warning. Locker 12 is trouble. If you work long enough in any institution, you'll hear those little superstitions, stories that seem foolish until you notice the pattern. Lionel, according to Maria's notes, didn't like the locker. He admitted it reluctantly, as if saying it aloud would make it worse. He had heard sounds metal clicking when no one was near it. He had watched the fluorescent lights above him flicker at the exact moment the locker opened, then steady when it closed, as if the electricity itself reacted to what was inside. He'd even seen the log system register the locker as open when it wasn't. A glitch, people said, a sensor error, a bad wire. But Lionel began to avoid that corner when he was alone. Maria didn't roll her eyes. She didn't declare it demonic. She did what good investigators do. She listened, and she wrote it down. She asked to see the logbook for Locker 12. The list of items inside felt like a timeline of violence. Guns from an old convenience store robbery in the 70s, a weapon tied to a police-involved shooting from the early 80s, and now this revolver from the Derrick case, resting among relics like a new bone in an old graveyard. Maria asked Lionel something simple. Who had accessed this locker recently? The answer should have been clean. It wasn't. There were sign-outs that didn't match schedules, names written in a hand that looked wrong, too careful or too sloppy, as if someone were imitating someone else, times that didn't fit with known shifts, nothing that would win a case by itself, but enough to wake a person up. Maria went back to the Derrick shooting file and listened again to the language. The officer's statement had that polished tone, the kind that comes from rehearsal or coaching. The report described a waistband gun, a sudden movement, a threat that forced an immediate response. It read like a template. A template only works when you use it more than once. So Maria searched for other shootings in that district where a suspect supposedly had a gun, where the situation was too fast, where the officer had no choice. She found cases separated by years, by different streets, by different faces, but the same phrases appeared as if they were stamped onto paper with the same seal. He reached, he turned, he pointed. I feared for my life. And in the margins of those older cases, she saw references to a gun that had appeared near a body, a weapon that didn't match the suspect's history, a piece of evidence that felt placed rather than found. The revolver in Locker 12 was old, yes, But what disturbed Maria was not the age of the metal, it was the age of the pattern. Father Lampert later wrote that there are two kinds of darkness people confuse. One is human sin, pride, greed, fear, and the sickening willingness to sacrifice another person to protect yourself. The other is the demonic, which feeds on sin the way mold feeds on damp wood. The demonic does not replace human guilt, it exploits it. It takes what is already broken and teaches it to break more efficiently. At this stage of the story, Maria still didn't know which darkness she was facing. She only knew that someone had written a young man's death into a clean narrative, and the story didn't fit the facts. She requested the emergency call recordings from that night. She compared timestamps. She noticed small differences between what the reports claimed and what the dispatch audio suggested, delays, overlaps, moments where voices sounded too calm for what they described. She spoke to people who had been in the store. Some were afraid, some were tired, some wanted to forget, but none of them could honestly say they saw Derek raise a gun. Back at the station, Maria felt the air change around her in a way no thermometer could measure. Not a literal chill yet, just the social cold that spreads when you begin asking questions that threaten careers. Doors closed faster. Conversations ended when she entered a room. A supervisor reminded her gently that she was making this bigger than it needs to be. And then there was the name that began to surface in whispers, an older sergeant, a man who had trained younger officers and who spoke about survival like it was the only virtue. In the report, Father Lampert read, he was called Caraway. He had influence in District 12. He had the kind of confidence that grows in a system that rarely corrects itself. He was close to Officer Mark. He had a reputation for saying the quiet part out loud. Better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. Maria heard that line and understood what it really meant in practice. It meant that fear could be treated like a license. It meant that killing could be justified before it happened, as long as the words afterward were arranged correctly. She did not yet know, in that first chapter of the case, how deeply the locker was tied to Caraway. She did not yet know the full history of the revolver. She did not know the term that would later be used, drop gun spoken, the way one might spit out poison. But she could feel the gravity pulling her towards something older than one shooting, something embedded in habit and protected by silence. Father Vincent Lampert, reading these records years later as the designated exorcist for his archdiocese, would have recognized the early signs of a spiritual trap without needing spectacle. The most dangerous snares rarely come with horns and smoke. They come with paperwork. They come with colleagues telling you to stop asking questions. They come with a whisper that says, just make it easier, just change one detail, just smooth one sentence. And somewhere, locked behind steel in a basement that smelled like old coffee and wet concrete, Evidence Locker 12 held a revolver that seemed to attract the same kind of story again and again, like a magnet drawing filings, like a wound refusing to close. Maria stood in that property room, looking at the logbook, and she realized she was no longer investigating a single shooting. She was standing at the mouth of a tunnel that ran back decades. She closed the binder, not because she was done, but because she knew the next step would make enemies. Then she did what honest people do when they're frightened but determined. She opened it again. Maria did not go to sleep that night. She went home, took off her shoes by the door, and stood in her kitchen with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator hum and the distant sound of traffic like a low tide. She had done this work long enough to know when a case was merely ugly and when it was organized. Organized ugliness has a different smell. It's quieter. It doesn't shout. It waits. The next morning, she returned to District 12 before most of the day shift had settled in. The building always felt older in daylight, its brickwork tired, its hallways too narrow, the kind of place where sound traveled farther than it should. She signed into the property room again, not because she expected Lionel to suddenly confess something new, but because she wanted to stand near that corner one more time and see if her instincts were exaggerating. Lionel met her at the counter with a clipboard and a guarded face. "You're back," he said. "I'm not here for you," Maria told him. I'm here for the locker. Lionel's eyes flicked toward the far corner like a child glancing at a dark closet. You know what they say, he muttered. I don't care what they say, Maria replied. I care what the log says. He slid the book toward her. She ran her finger down the entries again, names, times, case numbers. Most of it looked normal until you stared too long, and then the irregularities rose up like bruises. A signature that was too round, too careful, like someone was copying a name from memory. A timestamp that didn't match a known shift. A retrieval note without a corresponding return. Lionel watched her quietly, the way a man watches a fuse after someone lights it. You ever see anybody take it out? Maria asked, keeping her voice flat. Lionel swallowed. I see a lot of things. That's not an answer. His hands tightened around the clipboard. Look, detective, I'm not trying to lose my job. I'm not trying to get transferred to some midnight post where nobody backs you up. Maria leaned in, close enough that he could smell the coffee on her breath. I'm not asking you to accuse anybody. I'm asking if you saw the revolver leave the room when it shouldn't have. Lionel's jaw worked like he was chewing on something hard. Then, very softly, he said, sometimes the locker log says it's open when it isn't. Sometimes it says somebody checked something out when nobody signed in at the desk. That's all I'm saying. Maria's eyes narrowed. That's not a sensor glitch. That's a door and a key and a person. Lionel looked away. Or it's something else. Maria could have pressed him harder. She didn't. People like Lionel didn't survive in places like District 12 by spilling the truth all at once. They survived by dripping it out, drop by drop, hoping it evaporated before it became a flood. She left the basement and went upstairs with the logbook information burning in her mind. Her next step wasn't evidence, it was language. Because the cases she'd begun to find, the older shootings tied to that locker, shared more than a weapon. They shared the same polished phrases, the same rhythm, the same neat moral. The officer had no choice. And Father Vincent Lampert would later say that whenever you see the same lie repeated with the same cadence, you're not looking at panic anymore, you're looking at a script. Maria requested the files for the older cases linked to Locker 12. She didn't ask loudly, she didn't announce what she was doing. She pulled them quietly, the way you pull a thread when you suspect the whole garment is rotten. The first file she read was from decades earlier, a convenience store robbery that had ended with a suspect dead in an alley. The officer's statement in that case contained the same lines, only older, like a hymn sung in a different key. He reached for his waistband, he turned, he pointed, I feared for my life. The evidence photograph showed a gun near the body. The description of that gun matched the revolver now sitting in Locker 12. Maria sat back in her chair, staring at the page until the words blurred. A revolver didn't leap across decades on its own. Someone carried it. She flipped to another file, later in time, a shooting involving police and a suspect in a narrow stairwell. Again, the same lines. Again, a gun on the ground. Again, the same revolver listed as recovered. By mid-afternoon, she had a stack of files beside her that felt like a small grave. And she had a name that kept appearing in the margins, not always as the shooter, not always as the reporting officer, but as a supervisor, an approving signature, a presence. Sergeant Carraway. She asked around about him in the careful way an experienced detective does, not directly, not in a crowd, one question at a time, with a neutral face. Most people gave her nothing. Some people offered a tight smile and said, he's old school. One younger officer, looking down at his desk as if he expected the desk to report him, murmured, he protects his own. Maria nodded like she already knew, because she did. Every department has a man like that, a man who calls fear wisdom and calls silence loyalty. The danger is not only what he does, it's what he teaches others to do. That evening, Maria drove to a small Catholic parish where the department chaplain often met officers who didn't want their pain on the station record. It wasn't an official appointment. It was a conversation Maria needed because she had reached the point where the facts alone were not explaining the feeling in her chest. Father John Riley was there, sitting in a plain office with a crucifix on the wall and a stack of battered books that looked more used than decorative. He listened without interrupting as Maria laid out what she had found. The revolver, the repeated phrases, the locker log irregularities, the pressure to close the derrick case quickly. When she finished, she stared at the floor, her voice catching the way it does when you are trying not to admit you're afraid. "I don't know if this is just corruption," she said, "or if something else is in it." Riley didn't smile. He didn't scoff. He also didn't jump to the word that people always want to jump to. He said, "When you work around violence long enough, you start to believe the only two explanations are madness and malice. But there's a third thing, temptation, the temptation to make your conscience quiet." Maria looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means," Riley said carefully, "that sometimes the greatest evil is not the act itself, but the story we tell ourselves so we can live with it." Maria rubbed her eyes. "Then explain the locker. Explain the way the same gun shows up for decades like it's waiting." Riley leaned back, and his face changed slightly, as if he were choosing how much to reveal. "There was a chaplain before me," he said. "He kept notes, not official notes, personal notes, observations. He wrote about District 12 more than once." Maria's voice went quiet. "What did he say?" Riley stood and opened a drawer. From it, he pulled a thin folder, the paper edges worn soft. He placed it on the desk like something that had weight beyond its size. "This isn't a ritual book," he said. "It's not a manual. It's a warning." Maria opened it. Inside were a few pages of handwritten observations, careful and small. Riley watched her read, then said the name as if he didn't like letting it into the room. "Tester." Maria frowned. "What is that?" "A name the old chaplain used," Riley said. "He made it up from the idea of testimony and testing. He believed there was a particular kind of spiritual pressure that settles over places where people lie under oath and call it duty." Maria's fingers tightened on the paper. "A demon." Riley didn't take the bait. "A spirit that feeds on false witness," he said. That's how he described it. "Not a creature that throws furniture or scratches walls. A parasite. It doesn't need theatrics. It needs a pin." Maria's throat went dry. "That's insane." Riley nodded slowly. "It would be insane if it excused the men who chose to do wrong. But that's not what it does. It doesn't erase guilt. It magnifies it. It takes a small lie and makes it feel harmless. It takes a harmless adjustment and makes it feel necessary. It whispers, just change a word, just add a line. Keep your job, keep your badge, keep your life." Maria stared at the name on the page. Testor. A neat little word, a clean label for something filthy. Riley continued, his voice low, as if he were speaking to the part of the room that might be listening. "The old chaplain believed this spirit attached itself to evidence that was used and reused to solve the moral problem after the fact, a weapon placed near a body, a story polished to shine. He wrote that the spirit didn't pull triggers, it shaped narratives." Maria's mind jumped to the revolver in locker 12, the old steel, the repeated appearances, the way the same phrases were stamped into reports like a brand. She closed the folder. "If this is real," she said, "then that locker is what, a nest?" Riley's eyes did not leave her face. "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe it's just a door that's been opened so many times by sin that something learned it could come and go." Maria stood up too quickly, her chair scraping the floor. "I'm a cop," she said. "I don't chase shadows." Riley remained calm. "Then don't," he replied. "Chase the facts. Collect your evidence. And remember, the devil's favorite trick is to make you think you're alone." Maria let out a bitter laugh. "I am alone." Riley's voice softened. "No," he said. "You're just the only one talking out loud." Maria left the parish with the folder's words echoing in her head. She told herself she wasn't going to believe in demons because of a few handwritten pages. She told herself she was going to do her job. But that night, when she sat at her kitchen table and replayed the emergency call audio from the Derrick shooting, She noticed something she hadn't noticed before. Not a confession, not a smoking gun, something smaller. A hesitation in Mark's voice, a pause where the words should have come quickly, a breath, then a sentence delivered too smoothly, like it had been practiced. As if he were repeating what someone told him to say, Maria rewound it again and again until the hairs on her arms stood up. She thought of Caraway. She thought of Locker 12. She thought of that word Riley had said like a warning, testor. And then she remembered something Lionel had muttered in the basement, barely audible, as if he were afraid the walls would hear, or it's something else. The next day, Maria did something that felt like stepping onto thin ice. She requested access to the vehicle assignment logs and equipment sign-outs for the patrol units involved in the Derrick incident and the older cases. She didn't need to prove the supernatural. She needed to prove the human. She found small gaps, a patrol car that had been checked out early and returned late, a supervisor's initials on a form where they didn't belong, a line item that looked like it had been written in after the fact. Her stomach turned, not from fear of ghosts, but from the realization that the revolver in Locker 12 might not have been locked away at all. It might have been traveling quietly from trunk to scene to locker, carried by the same hands that carried authority. That evening, as the sun went down and the station lights turned the halls the color of old paper, Maria finally saw Sergeant Caraway in person. He was standing near the front desk, talking to two younger officers who laughed too loudly at his jokes. He had the stance of a man who believed the building belonged to him. When he noticed Maria, his smile didn't fade. It simply sharpened. "Detective," he said, friendly as a salesman. "Heard you've been digging." Maria kept her face blank. "I'm doing my job." Caraway nodded as if he admired her, then stepped a little closer. His voice dropped just enough to feel private. "Your job," he said, "is to keep the department safe. Keep the city safe. Don't go making a martyr out of some punk who got himself shot." Maria felt her pulse in her throat. He was unarmed. Caraway's eyes held hers, unblinking. "You weren't there." Maria's mouth went dry, and in that dry space she heard the shape of Riley's warning. "Just change a word. Just add a line." Caraway smiled again, and it was the kind of smile that promised consequences without naming them. "Be careful," he said. "People who go looking for monsters sometimes forget how to get home." Maria watched him walk away, and she realized something that made her colder than any basement locker ever could. Caraway didn't fear the investigation. He feared the truth being spoken plainly. And if Father Lampert's later reading of the case was correct, that was exactly where the real battle was headed. Not toward a gun, not toward a locker, toward a single sentence on a page, and whether a frightened man in uniform would dare to stop writing what the whisper told him to write. Maria did not answer Caraway's threat with a speech. She answered it with work. The next week moved in a rhythm that felt ordinary on the surface. Roll call, shift changes, ringing phones, the hum of the building settling into itself, but underneath, Maria sensed something tightening, like a net being drawn in, like a room slowly running out of air. She stopped pulling files through official channels. She started building her case the way you build something in a storm, low to the ground, reinforced, and quiet. She made copies at odd hours. She wrote notes by hand, then rewrote them in a cleaner form, leaving nothing that could be lost with a single misplaced folder. She kept her voice calm in public and saved her anger for the privacy of her car, where she could grip the steering wheel until her knuckles turned pale. Most of what she needed wasn't dramatic, it was boring. Equipment logs, vehicle assignments, evidence sign-outs, the kind of paperwork people ignore because they believe the truth lives in interviews and crime scene tape. But Maria had learned the truth often hides in the parts no one reads. She found patterns that didn't prove murder by themselves, but they proved opportunity. A patrol car checked out early, returned late, with no explanation. A supervisor's initials on a form that didn't require a supervisor's approval. A time written in ink that didn't match the digital entry. A signature that looked like someone practiced it first. She also started hearing the same sentence from different mouths, whispered in the hallway like a warning people wanted to pretend was friendly advice. Let it go, detective. One afternoon, she returned to the basement property room with a request Lionel couldn't deny. She had a legitimate reason to verify chain of custody on several older cases. She brought her badge, her paperwork, and her most neutral face. Lionel met her at the counter again, his eyes flicking past her shoulder. You're alone, he said. I won't be long, Maria replied. Lionel hesitated, then leaned in, lowering his voice as if the concrete walls could repeat it. They're watching, he said. Maria didn't pretend she didn't understand. Who? Lionel's mouth tightened. Everybody who's been here too long. Maria slid her forms across the counter. Lionel stamped them with hands that didn't quite stop shaking. As they walked toward the back corner, Maria noticed something she hadn't paid attention to before. It wasn't the locker itself. It was the way Lionel's steps changed when they got close. Shorter, faster. Like a man hurrying past a door he didn't want to see open. He stopped a few feet away and held up the ring of keys. You want me to open it, he asked. Maria watched him. You're the custodian. It's your job. Lionel swallowed. Yeah, he said. That's what everybody says. He inserted the key and turned it. The metal clicked, sharp and final, and Maria felt a small prickle on the back of her neck. Not fear, exactly. More like the sensation you get when you walk into a room where a conversation has just stopped. Lionel pulled the door open. Nothing leapt out. No roar. No slam. Just shelves and boxes and the stale smell of old paper. The revolver sat inside its evidence container like a patient thing, but the overhead lights did something strange. They fluttered, quick as a blink, then steadied. Lionel's eyes widened a fraction. Maria saw it. He saw that she saw it. Neither of them spoke. Maria leaned closer to the evidence container, reading the case markings. The revolver serial number was recorded. The bag seal was intact. Everything looked proper. And still, the wrongness clung to it. Not like a curse in the air, but like the weight of history pressed into metal. She stepped back and let Lionel close the locker. As the door shut, the light steadied fully, almost relieved. Maria looked at Lionel again. You ever notice that? She asked. Lionel shook his head too quickly. It's old wiring. Maria didn't argue. She simply filed the moment away, the way you file away a witness's pause before answering. Upstairs, Maria called Sam Patel. Sam wasn't part of District 12. That mattered. He was an internal affairs investigator who had the patient demeanor of someone who spent his life separating fact from loyalty. He was not a crusader. He didn't want drama. He wanted proof. Maria had been careful with him at first. She knew the risk of sounding paranoid, but now she had enough paper in her hands to speak plainly. They met after hours in a quiet corner of a diner that smelled like grease and coffee. Sam listened, his pen moving in short strokes, his eyes steady on Maria's face. When she finished, he didn't say, "This is impossible." He said, "If this is true, it's bigger than one shooting." Maria nodded. "It's a system," she said, "and Caraway is the hinge." Sam leaned back. "We can't take him down with a feeling," he said. "We need an undeniable break." Maria stared into her coffee. "Then we make him slip," she said. Sam's expression tightened. "You're talking about bait." Maria didn't smile. "I'm talking about pressure," she replied. "He's too comfortable. He thinks nobody will ever look at Locker 12 the way I'm looking at it." Sam tapped his pen against his notebook. "We'll audit," he said. "A full property room review, a forced inventory. It'll be procedural. If anyone resists, that's its own evidence." Maria nodded once. "And we bring Riley," she said. Sam paused. "The chaplain?" "The chaplain," Maria confirmed. "Not as a show, as a witness." Sam didn't love it. Maria could see that. But he also didn't dismiss it. He understood something important. When lies have lived in a place for decades, you don't only need law. You need a way to break the silence without asking permission. In the days that followed, Maria felt the building watching her more openly. Carraway didn't confront her again, but his influence moved like a shadow. A supervisor forgot to approve a request she'd filed. A report she needed was suddenly misfiled. People avoided meeting her eyes. The silence became a language, and then the city gave her the break she didn't want. It happened on a night when the sky hung low and heavy, and rain fell the way it does in Chicago, hard, cold, and relentless, turning alleyways into slick traps. Patrol units pursued a vehicle through narrow streets, tires hissing on wet pavement. The radio traffic was tight and clipped, voices overlapping, the sound of adrenaline stepping on itself. Mark Donnelly's unit was involved. Maria heard it from another detective first, then confirmed it in the dispatch summary. A pursuit ended in a tight alley. Command shouted. A sudden burst of gunfire that didn't sound like controlled shots, but like panic let loose. Shots fired. Officer down. Maria drove to the scene with her lights off, not to hide, but to keep from announcing herself. When she arrived, the alley was lit by strobes and headlights, rain pouring down in sheets, uniforms moving like dark shapes. The suspect was on the ground, alive, moaning, a hand pressed to a bleeding shoulder. His other hand was open, fingers spread, palm bright under the lights. Mark was down farther back, on his side, his face pale, his breathing fast and shallow. He was wearing a vest, but blood seeped from a place where the vest didn't cover, darkening his uniform. Someone yelled for an ambulance again, the same words, the same sequence, like the city was stuck on a loop. Maria forced herself to look for one thing, the revolver. She saw it near the suspect, partly in a puddle, water beating on the metal. It looked absurd there, like a prop dropped on the wrong stage. The suspect kept insisting, hoarse and desperate, that he never touched it. I didn't have a gun, he gasped. I didn't. A patrolman snapped at him to shut up. Maria didn't argue. She didn't make a scene. She simply watched. And she saw something else. The way the officers moved around the revolver wasn't the way officers move around a newly discovered weapon. There was no surprise, no pause. It was handled like a familiar object, like a tool being returned to its place in a routine. Maria felt her stomach twist. Ballistics came later. Confusion always comes first in a scene like that. But by the time the preliminary information reached her, the shape of the truth was already forming. The bullet that hit Mark did not match the suspect's weapon. It was friendly fire, a round from Mark's own gun, or from a nearby officer firing into the chaos. In the rain, in the narrow alley, with bodies close together, fear had done what fear does. It had made hands twitch. It had made sights jump. It had made men shoot faster than they could think. Mark was rushed into surgery. He survived, but barely. The hospital placed him in a sterile room where the air smelled like bleach and the lights never softened. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sedated, restless, sweating through sheets that were too white. Maria didn't go there as a friend. She went there as the person who needed to know how deep the rot ran. A nurse pulled her aside in the hallway, voice low. He's been talking, the nurse said. Maria's heart gave a hard, unpleasant thump. Talking how? Like he's confessing, the nurse replied. Like he's arguing with someone who isn't there. Maria walked into the room quietly and stood near the foot of the bed. Mark's eyes were half open, unfocused. His lips moved, his words slurred, but the meaning came through like a blade. I only wrote it like they said, he whispered. I only added a line, just one line. His breathing hitched. He swallowed, throat working. It told me, he muttered. It told me to say he turned, to say he pointed, to say the gun was there. Mark's eyes rolled, not toward Maria, not toward the ceiling, but inward, as if he were trying to look at something behind his own face. If I don't, he breathed, I lose everything. I lose my job. I lose. His voice cracked. Then, softer, almost like a child, it whispers. Maria stood very still because she had heard fear before. She had heard guilt. She had heard men try to blame alcohol, blame stress, blame a bad childhood, blame a bad partner. She had never heard a man on the edge of death describe a lie the way you describe a voice. Maria left the room and sat in her car for a long time with the engine off. Rain ticked against the windshield. The city's lights blurred into soft halos. She did not know if Mark's words were hallucinations from medication or the mind's attempt to make sense of shame. But she knew this: whatever you call it, sin, corruption, evil, or something darker, it had learned how to speak in the language of survival, and it was getting people killed. Maria called Sam Patel that same night. "This isn't just a dirty supervisor," she said, voice tight. "This is a pattern with a body count." Sam didn't ask her to calm down. He asked one question. "Can you prove the revolver was there again?" he said. Maria stared at the rain. "I saw it," she replied, "with my own eyes." "That's not enough," Sam said, "but it's close. We move now. We audit that locker. We do it by the book. We bring witnesses. We seal the room." Maria swallowed. "And we bring Riley," she said again. Sam exhaled slowly. "Fine," he said, "but we keep it professional." "It is professional," Maria answered. "Truth is professional." She ended the call and sat in silence, listening to the rain. Somewhere in District 12's basement, behind a steel door, the revolver waited, and Father Vincent Lampert, reading this account later, weighing every detail, would recognize what was coming next. Because the demonic does not like audits. It does not like light. It does not like witnesses. Most of all, it does not like a person who decides to stop adjusting the story and start telling it straight. Maria started the car, wiped the fog from the inside of the windshield with her sleeve, and drove toward the station, not to chase a ghost, to open a locker, and to see what the truth would cost when it finally had to stand in the same room as the lie.